A-team. Hey, good to see all of you. It's a really pleasure to be here, be with you. Always enjoy coming over and seeing you from time to time. And this is, of course, especially fun to be able to do this tonight. Our lesson is based on Isaiah, and I've entitled it Isaiah's Sons Living in Today's Disciples. When Teresa asked me this afternoon what I was going to do, I gave her the title, and she says, well, what does that mean? I said, well, if you knew what it meant, I wouldn't have to preach it. So that's why I'm preaching it. So anyway, that's what we're looking at tonight. So our text will be in Isaiah chapter 7 and 8. And I would urge you, if at all possible, and you don't have 15 kids climbing all over you, that you are able to look at the text, because otherwise you could get really lost. Am I still on? That changed. So something changed. I'm still on? Okay. All right. I don't know. Oh, it went red. That's what happened. We don't have a battery in this one. Pardon? Push the button, you muted it. I muted it. How did I? Well, okay, there you are. I don't know how I got my hand on that button, but there we did. Very good. If there's not one thing or another, that's it. At any rate, so the principles that we're going to look at in Isaiah 7 and 8 need a little bit of introduction just in case. So we're going to start with Matthew chapter 2 before we get into Isaiah, because I want you to see a prophetic principle, a principle of learning how New Testament writers used prophecy. So in Matthew chapter 2, we're just going to read verses 13 through 15 here. Matthew 2, 13 through 15. Text very well known, I'm sure, by most of you. This is about, of course, Jesus and the threat that he had of Herod when he's a baby to kill him and all the babies in Jerusalem. And so Joseph is told to take him into Egypt. So verse 13, now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy it. And he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, if you're like me, especially years ago, I'm studying the scripture and I read this and I go, oh, must be a passage somewhere in the prophets that said, out of Egypt I called my son, that applies to Jesus. Well, that sounds right, but it isn't right, because there is no prophecy in the Old Testament as you and I would think of prophecy. That is a prophet who says, when Jesus comes, you're going to have to call him out of Egypt. There's no such prophecy. What there is a passage in Hosea chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, that tells us, gives the quotation that came out of Matthew here. So read that with me. God in Hosea is trying to get the nation of Israel to understand their sins and to understand how much he's done for them and the need for them to come back to him. And in doing so, he tells them the good things he's done for them and the reason they should then serve him. So we read, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Of course, there's our quotation. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning offerings to the idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. So you can see, just in reading the full text here, that this is not a prophetic statement as we would understand a prophetic statement, that this is actually a historical statement. Hosea is written around 760 BC, and God is referring to something he did 700 years or so before when he brought Israel out of Egypt. And so we just see this simple historical statement that is made, that God is arguing, look what I did for you many years ago. I brought you out of Egypt, and you're treating me this way, and that is not right. And then we have Matthew coming over here, and he says when Joseph takes the baby and runs to Egypt, he says, well, that was to fulfill that prophecy back there in Hosea 11:1, that out of Egypt I've called my son. And I'm going, Matthew, you're a big fat cheater. That's not a prophecy. That's a historical statement. But then you realize Matthew does that over and over again. Peter does it in Acts 2. There's many passages in which historical events in the Old Testament is used as prophetic events in the New Testament. And that's what we're going to be looking at tonight from a passage in Isaiah. So we see that quote, but now we have to realize what's really taking place. The New Testament fulfillment in this particular case is escalated beyond the Old Testament event. In the Old Testament event, what actually happened? Israel, the nation, was brought out of bondage, out of a physical nation, Egypt, and set free. In the New Testament, Jesus now is being announced by Matthew to the Jews that now we are going to have a new Exodus, and here is a new leader who is going to come out of Egypt and lead us out of a greater bondage and to a greater promised land. So that's a pretty easy text to look at. You can see the same thing in the following verses with the killing of the children and Rachel weeping for her children compared to Jeremiah 31:15, which again is a historical statement. So we'll see that a lot of times, and I'm just making you aware of that so that you don't think that what we're about to do is cheating in our understanding or our how we define the prophecies of Scripture here. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this passage in Matthew 1 and verse 23, and you will recognize that. I'm sure just about everyone here will recognize that Mary, of course, is with child, and Joseph is told, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, and then speaks in verse 22 and 23 of Matthew 1, when he says, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. So when you look at that, that seems a very simple statement, and we all go, yep, got that. That's part of Isaiah that I've got down pat pretty good. Isaiah 7:14 gave that prophecy. But then when we look a little closer, we will find out that the context of Isaiah 7 and 8 reveals that the virgin that is going to conceive and give birth is Isaiah's child by his wife, and not a virgin at all. Well, that sounds kind of disturbing, doesn't it? But what he's doing is he's taking an Old Testament event and he's escalating it in a greater way in the New Testament, and then teaching us a lesson from Isaiah's context here. The Hebrew word, which I have on the screen here, Alma, that Hebrew word is not necessarily strictly translated as virgin. It can just mean young woman, or woman of even a single woman, or whatever, or even a married woman. It's a very generic word. As a matter of fact, the New Revised Standard Version actually translates it that way. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. The Net Version says, look, this young woman is about to conceive and will give birth to a son. You, young woman, will name him Emmanuel. All of you who remember 1947, which I do quite well, not actually, but in 1947, when the Revised Standard Version of the Bible came out and they translated this young woman instead of virgin, the entire religious world went berserk. And the reason they went berserk is you're claiming that Jesus wasn't born of a virgin. That was not what they were claiming at all. They were claiming that's the word. And if you look at the context is not referring to Mary specifically in the New Testament as a prophetic woman. It was referring to Isaiah's wife, who had already had one child and was now going to have another child, and the second child was going to be a sign to Israel. So that sounds disturbing at first, but when you look at it as we're going to do, you're going to see a larger message that is being used and sent by Matthew in the New Testament based on the context of Isaiah 7 and 8. How many of you here have seen Princess Bride? Yeah, we got quite a few people. So, one of my favorite little lines in Princess Bride is, "Anybody want a peanut?" Those of you who didn't see it aren't laughing. What's the matter with you? You haven't seen Princess Bride, you can't go to heaven if you don't see Princess Bride. That's it. That word you're using, I don't think it means what you think it means. Beautiful. There's all kinds of those, isn't it? New Testament writers do that all the time. And they expect you to know the story. And they will just give you they won't give you even a whole verse. Sometimes they give you 3 or 4 words, and you're supposed to just go, "Ha, there you go, got that one." How well do we do that? Not at all. we just go, "It was fulfilled." Okay, yeah, I got that. What we don't realize is going back and seeing the entire context allows the New Testament writer to be shorter in his discourse without having to fill in all the blanks, and he gives you just one little sentence or one little phrase that has a much larger message that will insert in this particular text. Matthew does that quite a bit, especially in these first 2 chapters, and he does it when he comes to Mary being a virgin and, of course, giving birth to Jesus. Now, let me assure you that Matthew uses a Greek word that is exclusively means virgin and cannot mean anything else. So there is no worry there. It's not like Jesus wasn't born of a virgin. Mary had never known man, and that's the way that is. But what is taking place is Matthew is taking an Old Testament event and escalating it into a greater message than the original Isaiah text. Now we're ready to actually go back and take a look at Isaiah. So Isaiah's sign is going to be, as you're going to see, a second son that is going to be like what happened with Mary and Joseph and in the New Testament and the coming of Jesus. And it's going to be about the fall of Assyria and Israel, who were threatening to destroy Judah, and then dealing with the greater threat of the conquering of Assyria. So that's going to be our picture, a similar and greater sign. So let's go back to Isaiah chapter 7, if you will. Go back to Isaiah chapter 7. Let me fill you in a little context. We don't have a lot of time to do this. I want to make sure, but I do want to make sure you get the picture because it's really beautiful. Isaiah 7 and 8 is where we're going to begin. If you'll look at verses 1 and 2 first off, you'll see pretty quickly the context. The king in Judah is Ahaz. He's a horrible, wicked king. He is not a good guy at all. And when you read those first 2 verses, you will see that both Syria and Rezin, the king Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the king of Israel, son of Remaliah, they're going to come up to Jerusalem and wage war against it, but could not mount an attack against it. When the house of David was told Syria is in league with Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. So here's the picture. Israel and Syria have joined together, and they are going up to attack Judah because Ahaz will not join them in one of their endeavors, and so they just want to attack him and take him out and put a new king in Judah. So that's their plan. All right, so Ahaz is against this and all this, and he's just shaking in his boots. He knows he can't defeat them. And so what he does, long story short here, what he does is he calls up Assyria and pays them off to come and do something about that, which was not what God wanted, of course. So God, in this particular situation, is trying to get Ahaz and the people of Judah to relax. Everything's going to be fine. I got this. These two countries aren't going to do anything to you because I'm not going to let them. Down in verse 10 of chapter 7, notice. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz. Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test. Don't you just want to slap the guy? I mean, come on. I would never ask the Lord of anything like that. This guy is the biggest rebel ever. He hates God. He don't want anything to do with him. He won't listen to him. He won't obey him. He's full of idols. And when he's told to ask a sign, I would just, he's acting like this syrupy, you just want to go yuck. This guy is just yuck. So watch the Lord. The Lord is not happy with it, I can tell you. Verse 13. And he said, Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you? The word you there, by the way, is plural. Is it too little for you to weary men that you would weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. So the birth then of, as Isaiah refers to it, the virgin, as Net Version and New Revised says to as a young woman, referring to Isaiah's wife, as we'll see, she's going to give birth, and he is going to be a sign that before he gets old enough to say what's right and wrong and all of that, the nation of Syria and Israel will be taken out, and he says you won't have to worry about them. Verse 17, though, he says, the Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not been since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah, the king of Assyria. In other words, because you didn't trust me and believe in me, not only will I have Assyria destroy Syria and Israel, I'm going to have Assyria destroy you too. So Ahaz now has been put under a condemnation from God as well. And so you see that. Now skip down to chapter 8, and you'll notice the fulfillment of the quote-unquote virgin prophecy. Chapter 8, verse 1. Then the Lord said to me, take a large tablet and write on it common characters belonging to Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. I never could figure out why nobody names one of their sons that today. You'd have all kinds of shorts for that one. So, and I will get reliable witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah, to test for me. And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said to me, call his name Maher-shalal-Hash-Baz. For before the boy knows how to cry, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. Okay? Doesn't that sound like what we just read earlier in chapter 7, following when the virgin gives birth? What's going to happen? Same thing. The child's going to grow up. Syria and Israel is going to be destroyed before the child gets of age. You have a very simple comparison. Obviously, the virgin is not exactly a pure virgin, as we would say. The Hebrew word allowed for a young woman, in this case, the wife of Isaiah. All right, so seeing that, I want you to go a little further, though. Take a look in chapter 8, verse 5. And he says, the Lord spoke to me again, because this people has refused the waters of Shiloh that flow gently and rejoice over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria. So coming against Judah now. And all his glory, and it will rise over all the channels and go over all its banks, and it will sweep into Judah. It will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Okay, very simple little summation here. Because you were disobedient, Assyria is not only going to destroy Israel and Syria, but Assyria is going to come in and destroy Judah right up to the neck. And then he says, "O Emmanuel." So, well, what's Emmanuel mean? God with us. God's going to still be with you. He's not going to completely desert you. He's going to keep his promises. So very, very simple little text there in spite of that. Now you go on to go down to verse 16. And he concludes this with, "Bind up the testimony, seal the teaching among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him." So what Isaiah does here is God has just warned him previous to this, just warned him, don't you buy into the conspiracy theories about Syria and Israel coming and destroying Judah. Don't you buy into that. Don't you follow that. You put your trust in God. You put your trust in me, God tells him. And therefore Isaiah does just that, and you see that in the words of verse 17. I will wait for the Lord who is hiding his face from the house of Judah. He's allowing Judah to get popped pretty good by Assyria, but he says, I will hope in him. Then look at verse 18. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel, signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion. So he says, me, Isaiah says, me and my two sons, Shear-Jashub and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, we are signs and object lessons to Israel that you ought to put your trust only in God and not in Assyria and not in yourselves and not in your own strength. You just put your trust in God. That's what we're, and we are signs and object lessons or portents of that. If you go back there to verse 12, when he warns him not to call these things a conspiracy, he says in verse 12, 13, and then look at verse 14, he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling to both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. There's another passage you recognize in the New Testament. Okay, so before we conclude our Isaiah, this part of Isaiah, notice the picture. God is either a refuge and a sanctuary, or he's a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. He's a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense in this situation when the people will hear God's message. Don't go to Assyria. Don't go to Egypt. Don't pay off these other nations. Relax. I got this. I will take care of these. Trust me. You wait for me. You wait in the Lord. Now, that sounds absolutely silly. You say, we don't think it's silly. Oh yeah, we do. What's looking in front of us is a no-brainer. Assyria can come in and destroy Syria and Israel, no problem, and protect us from what's going to happen. That sounds simple, and we got plenty of gold to pay them off, and they're willing to do it, so why not just do it? And God says, if you don't trust me, they're going to destroy you too. Trust me. You ever remember Hezekiah's, we always think a good king Hezekiah? At the end of the first section of Isaiah, chapter 38, 39, 37, 38, 39, that same thing happens. It actually happens that way. Assyria comes, surrounds Jerusalem. Remember the story of Sennacherib? Got them all surrounded, 185,000 of Sennacherib's army and all of this. And Hezekiah has been he's been just like Ahaz, doing everything he can to prepare for the invasion. And Isaiah keeps going, Hezekiah, 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 Stop it. The Lord says, relax. Take a little nap. Don't have a heart attack. Everything's going to be fine. Hezekiah, no, I got to do this, I got to do this. Call up Egypt. They'll come. All of this pays them off. Sends all kinds of things down there. Please, come and help us. Egypt goes, okay, thanks for all the money. Bye-bye. And he doesn't do anything. And God keeps going, listen. And finally, the captain of Sennacherib's army, the Rabshakeh as he's called or whatever, he just writes it all out and sends it to him. And Hezekiah finally just goes, I guess I have to give up and put it in the Lord's hands. You ever been that way? You fight it. You think you can change it. You think you can change your trials. You think you can do all that. Just like Job, you think you can do it. I thought I could do it, etc. And then you finally go, I guess I'll just let God take care of this. Oh, happy day. What a silly way we think. And that's what Hezekiah did. He finally went before the Lord and he took all the threats and he just laid it before the Lord. And he says, that's what they're doing. And God said, well, thank you very much. Go to sleep now and wake up in the morning and see my work. 185,000 of Assyrians are dead. And that's the same thing that he's trying to get happen here with Ahaz. God becomes a stone of stumbling when our trust is not fully in him. Everybody here is going, do you trust the Lord? Yes! Until something else seems more reasonable. Yeah. We know that. We've done that. We've been there. And we try our best to do it a different way. So what is Matthew's message here when he quotes a virgin will bear a child? And Matthew actually means a virgin, and he is borrowing an event, not an actual literal prophecy as we would think about it. He's borrowing an event from Isaiah's day and turning around and taking the event, just like we saw in Out of Egypt I'll Call My Son, and taking the event to send a broader message to his Jewish listeners. And that broader message then is simply this. Jesus is a sign that the Lord now is bringing about a greater deliverance, and that deliverance will be dependent upon him, not on humans, and not on their strength, and not on their power, and not on their righteousness. And it will force us, if we are going to treat him properly, it will force us to be like the tax collector that Jesus talked about at the temple, and not the Pharisee who boasted to God about his righteousness. And the tax collector simply says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. It forces us to take that route and not in any way count on any supposed goodness that we have. I think most of you know probably Eric Borlaug. Maybe he's preached here a couple of times. When Eric was training with me, he shocked the entire audience by standing up one morning and says, how many people here think you're a good person? And of course, and he said, none is good, no, not one. Ever heard that passage? Boy, I'll tell you what. I went, uh-oh, I'm going to have to fire this trainee. What are you talking about here? He's exactly right, of course. Any goodness that we try to ascribe to ourselves as far as the absolute good, as Jesus said to the rich ruler, there's only one good. There's only one good. We rely on the mercy of the Lord, and he's the one who forgives our sins and makes us righteous. We need to live that way every single day, and Matthew is showing that. There's an escalated deliverance here that Jesus is going to bring, and it's a deliverance that you see in Isaiah of the bondage of the nations and ultimately the bondage of Satan himself, which is summarized in Psalm 2. I begin to think that Psalm 2 summarizes pretty well every message of the Bible, because it emphasizes that God wins this battle with the nations and with Satan as to who's going to reign. And that's exactly what you see here. And we say, well, that just seems impossible. How could God then turn around and conquer the world and conquer Satan? And you and I go, well, he's God. But he's illustrating how that is not impossible, because I just showed you I can bring a child from a virgin. And that is assurance to you that I will deliver you from bondage, and I will deliver all of us from the bondage that we have in sin. Now, that is so easily said, and all of us know it so well. I wonder how much it impacts us. How much does it really strike you every single day that, as Isaiah many times said, when the Messiah comes, he's going to open the prison doors and let the prisoners out? Did you ever think of yourself as a prisoner in prison? Did you ever think of yourself in this deep, dark bondage? The Lord said through Paul in Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Every one of us here was under that curse. The wrath of God is what we had to escape. We were in bondage to Satan, and we are under that wrath. And if not for God, this would have been fulfilled against us. When Isaiah prophesied at least 7 times, he talked about a new exodus. A new exodus that would come in the Messiah. Before I understood Isaiah and read Isaiah, I didn't think of myself being in the kind of bondage that was worse than anything Israel would have experienced in the land of Egypt. Many of us grew up on the pew, and if you said, well, did you do some really bad things? And some of us would say, yeah. And some of us say, well, I was a pretty good person. And the result of that is how we live. Do we live as those who've been freed from this bondage, or are we like Simon the Pharisee in contrast to the sinful woman in Luke 7? Remember Simon? He invites Jesus to dinner, but the woman walks in and she cannot stop kissing his feet. And her tears flood his feet, and she wipes them clean with the hair of her head. And she anoints him with his feet with precious oil. And what does Simon say? In his mind, he goes, yeah, if this guy were a prophet, he'd knew what kind of junk this woman really is. And Jesus said, Simon, there were 2 debtors. One owed 50 denarii, the other owed 500. When neither could repay, he forgave them both. Which will love him more? If you know you were forgiven much, you will love much. And if your lifestyle is to give God mediocre service, and if you lack passion for what God has done, and it's just kind of a go-to-church religion, you have not felt the impact of your sin. You say, how do I get out of that? How do I change that? The closer you draw to God, the more you know God, the more you get into finding out really who he is. The closer you get to him, the more you'll see the seriousness of your sin. just like Peter falling down at Jesus' feet and saying, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful man." You know, it's funny, months before that he didn't feel that way. But now he understands. Every day you and I need to wake up and say, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Every day I'm going to wake up and give him all I can. Because the one who's forgiven much loves much. There's that impact. That's what Matthew is trying to get across. And one other thing on that. Do we trust God's deliverance or do we doubt? I run into Christians all the time. Say, "Well, you know, I hope I'll be saved. I'm weak and I'm not very good at times, and I fail a lot, and I don't know if he'll save me. Maybe he will. I hope he will." You sounded like Ahaz. Sound like Ahaz. The reason for the sign is he's doing what you and I think is the impossible, saving sinful people like me and like you. And he doesn't expect us to start thinking that somehow, some way, I'm going to do enough to deserve it. That's just not the case. And that's a very powerful lesson that comes out of just that thought. Now I want you to see one more parallel here. Remember we read in chapter 8 and verse 16 of Isaiah, "Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents," or object lessons in Israel. Well, that passage is also quoted in the New Testament and is an important part of this story. The quotation here is in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 13, which is again an escalation of the story that was presented in Isaiah that we just learned and read. So our last text this evening will be in Hebrews chapter 2. And so if you will turn over there, and we'll give a quick rundown of the context so that we can understand it, understand the final point there in verse 13. So Isaiah 2, beginning at verse 5, is where this discourse begins here. And the Hebrew writer says, "For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere." The Hebrew writer, for some reason, never knew book, chapter, and verse. He just always said somewhere. It's Psalm 8. So y'all, when you get there, you get the Hebrew writer and say, "We need to teach you some book, chapter, and verse." Psalm 8. "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control." Now, did you catch what he has said here? The prophecy of man's dominion over the world to come, so that there is nothing out of his control. Has it ever bothered you that when you read this in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, and he said, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over all that." And then David quotes the same passage in Psalm 8, talking about how you have given power, glory, and honor and dominion and crowned man with all of this. Has it ever bothered you that it didn't feel like it? Yes. Read it many times and went, "Lord, I don't feel like we have dominion over anything." Fortunately, the end of verse 8 actually tells us it hasn't happened yet. And he says, "At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him." I'm glad we aren't experiencing something that I didn't feel like we were experiencing at the time. And then he says, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor. That's the same thing man was promised to be crowned with. Crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory. Notice that? That's that promise. Bringing many sons to glory. Who's bringing us to glory? Jesus is the same glory and honor that he has obtained. And so bringing many sons to glory should make the founder, other versions, pioneer, Net version, trailblazer, notes, trailblazer of their salvation perfect through suffering. What the Hebrew writer is simply saying is, we have not attained what was promised, but we do see Jesus who has attained it, and he attained it through suffering. Why is that important to the Hebrew Christians? Because they've been Christians for many, many years now, and they're suffering, and they've been suffering the whole time, and they're ready to quit. And he tells them in chapter 10, you have need of endurance, and then he gives them reasons. You don't want to miss this. You ever been in a situation in your faith where you started wondering, maybe you're slipping, maybe getting weak, you're not doing what you ought to be doing, your prayer life goes south, your reading of the scriptures is just non-existent, you're not seeing other Christians very often, you start just getting more and more demoralized as far as your Christian life. And the Hebrew writer says, God has planned to put the world to come all under your feet, and you'll have dominion over it, and you'll be crowned with glory and honor, just as Jesus was. And you'll get there through suffering. You have to follow your trailblazer. That's the setup here for the quotation that we're going to see. So it was fitting, he's bringing us to glory, and he is therefore, look on at verse 11, he who sanctifies, and those who are sanctified all have one source, or the Greek really is just all are one. That is why he's not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise, and again I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children of God, the children God has given me. Notice that one? That's from Isaiah 8. That's what we just read. So Jesus is not ashamed to call us brothers, because we are willing to follow him through suffering in order to get crowned with glory and honor as he was, and that he will bring us to sit with him on his throne. If we didn't say anything else tonight, that ought to be enough to say, why would you miss that? When I get done reading that, I just kind of go, I have no idea what you're talking about. Paul just casually says, in 1 Corinthians 6:3, do you not know we're going to judge angels? And we all go, huh? What did he say? I have no idea what he's talking about. And the Hebrew writer hears, you're going to have dominion over the world to come. You go, what? He's giving us glimpses of his plan of giving us glory and honor. But the path is through suffering. So now we've got to figure out what that path actually is. He quotes two passages. The first one is Psalm 22:22. Anybody recognize Psalm 22? Begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Pretty common for us, isn't it? We remember Jesus saying that on the cross, etc. Well, he quotes Psalm 22, verse 22. And then he quotes our passage, Isaiah 8, verse 17 and 18. Let's look at these and then see the final message. Psalm 22, I'm going to begin in verse 21 here, and I've just got it on your screen to save some time here. This is up to verse 21, part A, David is saying, God, please help me. God, please rescue me. God, please come. Why have you departed from me? Why have you forsaken me? Why, you've never done this before. Why don't you come to me? Oh, it's all these please, 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 all the way down. And then in verse 21, part B, he suddenly switches and he says, you have rescued me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. That's the quote in Hebrews. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. All you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. All the ends of the earth shall remember. Turn to the Lord, all the families of the nations shall worship before you. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship before him shall bow. All who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. Did you see the message now, just very briefly, did you see the message of Psalm 22? It began with hopelessness. Why have you forsaken me? It ended with, you've never turned your face away from me. You've never hidden yourself from me. I can now blast it before the world that God will never, ever forsake you. He will be with you to the end. He was with David to the end, and he is also with Jesus to the end. There's an escalation here that if God delivered David, he would deliver David's Messiah. And God will deliver all who are the brothers of Jesus. I'm always sad. I don't know if you guys sing it here, but I never say much, but I say enough. There's a song, a very pretty song, that says, the Father turned his face away. My goodness. The Father never turned his face away. Because if he did, this passage makes no sense. And the Hebrew writer, who is banking on these suffering Christians understanding that we are brothers and that he would never turn his face away in the deepest trial, that passage would make no sense and the Hebrew writer would have missed it altogether. No, he rescued me. He did not hide his face. And then the Hebrew writer uses that to say, you don't ever have to worry that God would desert you. Even at a time when it feels like it, it is not true. Even over those, he said, who could not keep himself alive. We need to put our trust in God. That's Isaiah's message. And then the final one. Isaiah's children, signs and portents, object lessons to Israel. Here's the picture. Isaiah had two kids. Shear-Jashub, a remnant will return, and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. You ever thought about these prophetic kids that walked around in the Old Testament? You know, Isaiah has a kid, and you go, what's his name? Shear-Jashub. A remnant will return. What? Your kid name, a remnant will return? Well, what's this other kid's name? Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. The spoil speeds and the prey hastens. Well, what's that mean? You guys are going to be wiped out and there's only going to be a small amount, but have hope. Emmanuel will be with us if you trust him. That's kind of funny. You might see them going to kindergarten, you know, and they're telling their names. That would be just weird. There's the idea. What does Hebrews do with it? He takes the children of Isaiah and the quote from that escalates it to refer to us as the offspring of Jesus. By the way, Isaiah 53 verse 10 says that when Jesus died, he still saw his offspring. We become the offspring of Jesus, and then because we follow him through suffering, he called his brothers, but in this case, we are the children of Jesus and become, as Isaiah's children, signs and object lessons to the world of the coming judgment, just like with Assyria, but of a coming hope as well. That if you will trust in God and not in yourself, you will be part of the remnant that will be saved. Three main object lessons then that we've learned. Number one, very simple. Never read a New Testament quote without understanding the Old Testament text. Very important. You will know more about the Lord if you'll do that than any other way. Secondly, Jesus' virgin birth is a sign from God that God is with us. He'll never depart from us. He will always be there, giving us confidence of our own exodus, our own deliverance, our own salvation, and the time in which all the enemies will be destroyed. And thirdly, we're the offspring of Jesus. Living signs and object lessons to the world to follow the suffering servant, and that we also are willing to suffer in order for us to become those signs and those object lessons, in order to get the message of the gospel and the great picture of what Isaiah gave. We should be filtering through the world to make that happen. Paul explained it this way: for we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be visible in our mortal flesh. How is the life of Jesus going to be visible? How are you going to be children and brothers of Jesus? Because as Paul said in the last statement, so death is at work in us and life in you. We're never going to be the offspring of Jesus in the sense that Isaiah gave it, standing as signs and object lessons to the world, if we keep to ourselves. If our churches just become clubs in which we enjoy one another and high-five each other that we've made it, we're never going to be signs and portents and object lessons to the world. Our job is to follow the trailblazer through suffering. We'll never reach the world by lobbing some verse grenades at them as we pass by. We must give our life up for them. We must die so they can live. Our lives now are escalated beyond what Isaiah's message was in his children. Great to be with you tonight. We're going to stand and sing our song. Thank you.